Welcome to Legit Games. I am Swish, and today we are drinking jalapeno flavored coffee because we have a spicy brew. Today we're going to be playing 8-Tog. Now before we go into the deck tech, if you enjoy this video series, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see more tutorials in the future, please subscribe to Legit Games on YouTube. Now lastly, I don't really do these videos for money, but it does take money to make them. So if you're interested in supporting the channel financially, you can find the link to our Patreon page in the description below. So when Kaladesh was released, they created a functional reprint of a classic card called 8-Tog, and the reprint is called Ravenous Intruder. Now, every time they functionally reprint something, I always want to see if it's worth building a deck around it, because being able to have 8 copies of a single card in your deck just adds a ton of consistency. The question is whether or not having a card like that consistently in your deck is really worth having, and that's kind of what we're testing today. So the two cards that we're really focusing on are 8-Tog, which we're using the Mirrodin block version of them because I like the artwork a little bit better. But essentially what the card does is it's 2 mana for a 1/2. You can sacrifice an artifact and give the creature +2/+2 until end of turn. Now the functional card that's just the same as 8-Tog is Ravenous Intruder, which does the exact same thing. They're essentially the same creature, except for one's a gremlin and the other's an 8-Tog, which, really, what is an 8-Tog? Maybe an 8-Tog is a gremlin. We don't know. Now, to make this deck work, we need to have lots of food for our 8-Togs, and we're going to be using a lot of 1-mana artifact cantrips. So 4 copies of Chromatic Star and 4 copies of Terrarian. Essentially, the cost is the same. They both draw you a card when they hit the graveyard, and they both also kind of fix your mana if you need it. Also in Kaladesh, we got the Implement cycle, and we're going to be running 2 different implements. Implement of Combustion, which if we don't have an 8-Tog, we can sacrifice it to deal a damage to a player, and Implement of Ferocity, which lets us put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. Now, all of these artifacts will draw you a card when they hit the graveyard, so they make really good food for the 8-Togs. We can sacrifice them, get a big swing in, draw a bunch of cards, and then be able to swing again the next turn. It's kind of similar to like a Kiln Fiend deck, where you just want to cast a bunch of spells and then attack with a big Kiln Fiend. The objective of this, though, is that you don't have to swing in for a whole pile of damage all at once and kill your opponent right then and there. Being able to draw all the extra cards off of your eggs kind of gives you a setup to where you can attack for big damage over a couple of turns to win the game. Now, to kind of amplify the damage from our 8-Togs, we also have a full playset of Disciple of the Vault, which is a really powerful card that used to be banned in Standard, but is still legal in Modern, and it doesn't see a lot of play. Usually you would see this in Affinity with Arcbound Ravager, but you would also see it with Artifact lands, which are currently banned in Modern. But with this deck, we're going to be sacrificing so many artifacts. The Disciple of the Vault gives us a lot of reach. So if our opponent, gets some blockers down or prevents us from being able to attack for whatever reason, we can just, cast a bunch of our eggs and then sack them to our 8-Togs, and then Disciple of the Vault kind of finishes the thing off. Essentially, if you have a couple of Disciples of the Vault down at the same time, sacrificing artifacts just adds up to so much damage so quickly. Now, to help kind of protect our deck from removal spells, since we are a little light on threats, we do have 3 copies of Inquisition of Kozilek, and we usually use these to find removal spells out of our opponent's hand and try to strip them of that removal spell. It also finds itself useful against a lot of combo decks. We can slow down their combo long enough for us to get across for a lot of damage. We also have a couple of copies of Fatal Push, which is a great way to get blockers out of the way, because in order for this deck to work, we don't have trample or anything, so we do need to destroy our opponent's creatures if we can. And once our opponent gets us to the point where they've stalemated us and they can't, they can block, that's when we can start bringing out the Disciples of the Vault. In addition to the Fatal Pushes, I was originally running Lightning Bolt as a secondary removal spell, but I started using Shrapnel Blast, and Shrapnel Blast with all of your eggs is just an incredible amount of value. You're paying 2 mana for 5 damage, it could be a creature, it could be a player, and generally you're sacrificing an artifact that draws you an additional card, so this just ends up closing the game out really, really fast. Now, lastly, out of Kaladesh, we also got another card called Pia's Revolution, which I'm currently running 3 copies, but I think 2 copies might might actually be the right answer. We're going to run 3 today just to see how it goes. But essentially, it's an enchantment, and whenever you sacrifice an artifact, or whenever one of your artifacts goes to the graveyard, your opponent can pay 3 life to prevent you from putting it back into your hand. Now, once you get your opponent down to a low life total, they don't have a choice. They pretty mostly have to allow you to put the artifact back into your hand, which lets you kind of cycle and then just recast all of your eggs over and over and over again until you can get into the answers, into the winning game position that you need. Now, for the mana base, I was originally running 18 lands, and I thought that that was going to be sufficient since the majority of our deck is 1-drops, and the majority of our 1-drops let us draw additional cards. But I found a lot of my opening hands were too land light to be able to pull off all of our 2-mana and 3-mana spells, so I upped it to 20 lands. And I think that that's necessary because I run a lot of colorless lands in this deck, and you need to have enough colored sources of mana in order to be able to cast all of your other stuff. But the first 4 lands are Blinkmoth Nexuses. Blinkmoth Nexuses can turn into artifacts, which means in a pinch we can sacrifice them to ATOGs to make them a little bit bigger. Man lands are also a great way to get reach in a deck like this. Obviously, we can only run so many creatures, and being able to have just a simple 1/1 flyer that gets across and pings for a point of damage every now and again is a good way to kind of manage our opponent's life total to where we can get ourselves into a position where we can sacrifice and have a big swing for the win. We also have Darksteel Citadels, which are artifact lands, which we can sacrifice to our ATOGs in a pinch. We have 5 different fetch lands, 4 Bloodstained Mires and 1 Wooded Foothills. And then we also have 5 shock lands, so 4 copies of Blood Crypt, and we're also running 1 copy of Stomping Ground. The 1 copy of Stomping Ground is really just so we can occasionally sacrifice our Implement of Ferocity if we really need it, and it also gives us some options in the sideboard. But even if we don't have the Stomping Ground, or if our opponent destroys it for whatever reason, like a Ghost Quarter, we have the 4 copies of Terrarion and the 4 copies of Chromatic Star, so we can usually get the color mana we need if we absolutely need it. We do only run 2 basics because we are running such a low land total. We only have 1 mountain and 1 swamp. And those are really just there in case our opponent Path to Exiles us. We may want to get those. It's also a good way to kind of save our life total if we're in a situation where we're playing against a really aggressive deck like Burn or something like that. Now, in the sideboard, I'm toying with the sideboard a little bit. I think that it needs a little bit more polishing, but for the most part, I think this is the sideboard that we're going to use today. We have 1 copy of Duress and another copy of Inquisition of Kozilek. This brings us up to 5 discard spells if we're running against an opponent who just has a ton of removal spells like Grixis Control or something like that. Or if we run into a really big combo deck like Storm or something like that. We do have an additional copy of Fatal Push, which is just if we run into decks that have a lot of creatures, so we can get past those blockers if we need to. One of the weirder cards that I have in my sideboard is Tainted Remedy, which is a card that I've been wanting to try out for a while in a sideboard. I actually tried it out in my 8-whack deck in the first video that we recorded for Legit Games. Tainted Remedy is it's there specifically for people who are going to bring in life gain to prevent us from going off on our combo. It's really good against like Wormcoil Engines if you're playing against Tron, or Core Firewalker if you happen to be playing against some sort of like Death and Taxes deck or a Hate Bears deck. So it's just a neat card. I haven't gotten a whole lot of experience playing this card yet, so I don't know if it's all that great. But we're going to try it out in this particular version. We'll see if it ends up being useful this round of matches. Against decks that kind of go wide, like Elves or even Affinity, we have a couple copies of Anger of the Gods. Anger of the Gods is also really good against any of you like your Malira combo decks, with the Kitchen Finks or the Murderous Redcaps or things like that, because it prevents anybody from coming back from the graveyard back into play. That exile effect is very powerful with Anger of the Gods. Against Tron matchups or any matchups where lands are kind of important, we've got a couple of copies of Molten Rain. Against decks that have enchantments or artifacts that can potentially wreck us a little bit, we do have some natural states. One card that you would think that would be good against us is Stony Silence, but Stony Silence, it does affect Darksteel Citadel, and it does affect all of our eggs if we need to sacrifice them kind of naturally, but they don't affect ATOG really in any way, shape, or fashion. So we can still just cast our artifacts and sack them to ATOG and still come across for a big pile of damage. So Stony Silence is a card that kind of hurts us, but not nearly as much as you would think, like it does with, say, Affinity or Tron. And to hedge our bets against the graveyard decks, we do have 3 copies of Nihil Spellbomb, which is a 1-mana artifact that gets the graveyard, but it's also another way to draw a card. It's just like kind of our other egg. So even if we board it in and we don't need it to destroy a graveyard, we can always sacrifice it to an ATOG and potentially draw a card if we've got the open mana to do so. And that is the deck. We're going to be running this deck through a 5-round Modern Friendly League. And like I say, this is kind of a brew. It's a very untested deck. We're going to be throwing this deck up against a lot of established, powerful modern decks. So there's a likelihood that this deck doesn't really do well. Anytime you're taking a new deck that is really untested, unproven, you can't expect to do well in a matchup. But on the other side, on the flip side of it, if we do really well with this deck, we'll feel really good about ourselves for it because we kind of built this deck from scratch.